Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depends from where you are joining us. I am Magda Tedder. I'm the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham University, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you joining us today in these very challenging, somber, and dark times. Ever since the ruthless Hamas attack on civilian communities inside Israel, I've been thinking about Maya Angelou's quote, hate, it has caused a lot of problems in the world, but has not solved one yet. This quote rings particularly true these days. We planned to screen Iris Zaki's film, Egypt, a Love Song, a long time ago, and I hope that you were able to see it or will see it after this talk today. We did not know we'd host this event during a war. The film tells the story of a famous Egyptian Jewish singer, Suad Zaki, and the complicated love between her and her Arab Muslim musician, her husband, whom she married when they were performing together. The film allows us to lift our eyes away from the horrifying news coming out of Israel and the region and dwell for a moment on the bittersweet story that exposes a history which is now forgotten and given today's reality almost seems impossible. We're sorry that the filmmaker Iris Zaki could not join us. We did not want to do a panel without her, so we decided to reschedule the conversation between Iris Zaki, Mohammed Al-Siadi, and Alon Tam about the film for another time, and we'll keep you posted about it. Today's event reminds me of the series we created in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Scholars at War. And I'm very grateful to Alon Tam, who is joining us from Israel today in these very difficult times, for wanting to share his work with us despite these challenging circumstances. Alon Tam is a social historian of modern Egypt and of its Jewish community. He has written about the social and political history of Cairo's coffeehouses, about Cairo's Jews and their place in its urban history, as well as on other topics ranging from the Jewish press in Tangier in Morocco to Blackface in Egyptian theater. Alon Tam received his Ph.D. from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania, and in 2020-2021, the year when we were all online, he was the Rabin-Shvidler postdoctoral fellow at Columbia and Fordham. He also has held postdoctoral fellowships and teaching positions at Penn, UCLA, and currently at Gurion University and Tel Aviv University. אני אסירת תודה, אלון, שאתה איתנו. Before I hand over the screen to Alon, I want to invite all of you to join us next week on Tuesday, October 24th at 6 p.m. For a hybrid event in person and also on Zoom for a panel conversation in our Black Studies and Jewish Studies in Conversation series on a topic shared past, divided present. Museums and public history with really eminent panelists, Christy S. Coleman, Erica Lehrer, and Annie Poland, and I will share the link with you. If you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A section of the screen, and I will field the question after the talk. We'll have a few minutes for them. So without further ado, Alon, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Magda, for having me. I'm really happy to be joining Fordham again. As Magda mentioned, I was the joint postdoctoral fellow at Columbia and Fordham a couple of years ago, And here I'm joining you again from a dire situation. Actually, a siren just went off, but since I am broadcasting to you from my bomb shelter, that I decided not to run, and I'm still with you. And yeah, I'm really happy to do this talk, which is based on my research on Cairo's coffee houses, as Magda mentioned, and on the also on the place of Jews in the urban history of Cairo. And it is based on a couple of articles, one recently published in Jewish Social Studies, and the other is forthcoming in an edited volume, hopefully, hopefully soon. So I'll try to share my screen. Um, can you see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
All good. Okay. So um, such were the relations between the three religions, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, before the outbreak of Israel's War of Independence, the 1948 war. Back then, no differences were felt or any distress or hatred between us and them existed, only respect and mutual appreciation, even tight friendship. This is how Maurice Uzon described the atmosphere at his father's coffee house, Ahawat al-Sharq, coffee house al-Sharq in Arabic, which was located in Daher, Cairo, during the 1930s and 1940s. Even when tensions began to rise after 1948, his family's relationships with its Muslim Egyptian friends and neighbors remained strong, according to Maurice. So in what follows, I will use Maurice's memoirs of public spaces in Cairo, mostly Ahawat al-Sharq, but also public parks and other places, as case studies to explore the kind of opportunities that they offered Jewish Egyptians and how they used those opportunities to assert their place in Egyptian society. It demonstrates how urban history can offer a unique perspective on the actual social meanings of Jewish identity in everyday life. What transpires most strongly from such a perspective is the centrality of social hierarchy to the urban Jewish Egyptian experience of that time. It was the emerging urban middle-class culture obsessed with modernity and shared with Muslims and Christians that allowed Jews to carve out an equal place for themselves in Egyptian society. It helped them form strong social bonds with their neighbors across confessional lines, bonds that could withstand challenges, at least for a time. This micro-history relies on an interview that I conducted with Maurice Uzon in 2015 at his home in Bat Yam, Israel, on the few documents that his father kept and Maurice showed me, and on a short memoir that he published in the Journal of the Association of Egyptian Jews in Israel in 2006. As a form of historical anthropology, Maurice's testimonies capture everyday experiences and interactions, their meanings, as well as the understandings of spaces and intercommunal relationships. This kind of information and insight is usually lost in other historical sources. As with all sources, life stories have their own challenges, and to mitigate them, I will closely deconstruct Maurice's testimonies and contextualize them within the urban history of Cairo and the social history of its Jewish community. So, according to his 1926 Egyptian identity card, Shahata Ezra Uzon, Maurice's father, was born in Jerusalem. This meant that, like most Jewish Egyptians, he too had recently migrated to Egypt in search of a better life. Egypt's economy had been growing exponentially since the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the success of its cotton industry, and the inviting environment for foreign investment created by British colonialism. It attracted significant waves of migrations from the Middle East and North Africa, from around the Mediterranean, and from all parts of Europe. The immigrants were of all stripes: big investors and small entrepreneurs, administrators and experts, skilled and unskilled laborers. At the same time, the economic boom and the industrialization of rural agriculture both pushed and pulled large waves of migrants from the Egyptian countryside to Cairo and Alexandria. The Jews among these immigrants fundamentally changed the makeup of the Jewish community in Egypt. From about 5,000 Jews there in the mid-19th century, the community swelled to around 65,000 according to the most conservative estimates in the interwar period. That is more than a 13-fold increase in population that had far-reaching implications for the social history of that Jewish community. Most of the Jewish immigrants came from all over the Ottoman Empire, the Arab Middle East, North Africa, Anatolia, and the Balkans, especially Greece. About 10% of the immigrants were Ashkenazi Jews from Russia, Romania, and Poland. Due to its geographical proximity and long shared history, back and forth migration between Egypt and late Ottoman or British Mandate Palestine, where Shahata Uzon came from, was also very common. Many, if not most, of the Ashkenazi Jews that I just mentioned came through Palestine, like the famous Ambash family, the family of the current Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, on his mother's side. Tens of thousands of mostly Russian Jews were deported to Egypt by the Ottomans during World War I. Some remained there after the war, some returned to what was now British Palestine, and some migrated elsewhere. But the connections between Egypt and Palestine, and all the way back to the ancient land of Israel, if you will, were much more mundane. One testimony of a member of the Yishuv, the pre-1948 Zionist settlement, tells how he popped on the train to Cairo to buy a wedding dress for his wife-to-be at the famous Sikurel department store, owned by Jewish Egyptians originally from Ottoman Izmir. Contrary to popular perception, perpetuated by both Jewish and non-Jewish Egyptians, only about 25 to 30% of the Jewish Egyptian community actually had some kind of European, usually French, Italian, or British citizenship or legal protection. And even that number fell rapidly since the 1930s. The rest were either Egyptian nationals or stateless, usually of Ottoman origin. This made them Egyptians in the eyes of the law, as they did not enjoy the extraterritorial legal privileges and protections that foreign nationals enjoyed until 1937. Finally, it is important to note that Jewish immigrants to Cairo and Alexandria did not come only from outside Egypt either. Many Jews from smaller communities in the countryside were part of the big move to the cities. I should also note that most scholars of the Jewish community in Egypt have rarely considered its history in the framework of migration studies. I contend, for example, that Jewish Egyptian history has as much in common with Jewish American history and with any other Jewish community in the Middle East and North Africa. Egypt's economic boom offered most of those immigrants the opportunity to climb the socioeconomic ladder, either in their own lifetime or within just one generation in their families. This upward mobility fitted in with the rapid social changes that took place in Egypt from the middle of the 19th century. These changes included new groups carving out a space for themselves in the Egyptian social hierarchy, a growing wealth disparity between the different social classes, and the adoption of new lifestyles. Most of the Jewish immigrants to Egypt were part of that emerging middle class. Historian Gudrun Kremer estimated that as many as 60% of the Jewish community in the interwar period belonged to that social class, while about 10% were elite or very rich, and the rest were either in the lower classes or very poor, lumpenproletariat. This social makeup was different from the larger Egyptian society, most of which remained lower class and rural at that time. The relatively small numbers of the Jewish community might explain this anomaly. Middle-class Jews were mostly merchants or commercial agents, bureaucrats in the expanding state apparatus, administrators, salespeople, craftsmen, and professionals. The elite were bankers, investors, big businessmen, and managers. The lower and poor classes were laborers, peddlers, small artisans, and irregularly employed or unemployed people who lived on the community dole. It should be noted that in that period, even one middle income salary could provide a middle-class lifestyle for an entire family. The main socioeconomic strategies for reaching the middle class were working in retail and having good higher education, preferably in French, but also in the modern Arabic one. As crucial as these socioeconomic strategies were, other sociocultural actions were also needed in order to be part of the Egyptian middle class, known as effendiya in Arabic. It was, first of all, a very urban phenomenon. People living in rural Egypt could very well be rich as part of the landed aristocracy, or mostly very poor agriculturists, falahin, but they were not effendis. Being an effendi meant an urban life, dressing in European style, and for men wearing the tarbush, flaunting some use of the French language, either on its own or mixed with Arabic, having and enjoying leisure time by playing sports, using photography, listening to music, watching films, going to the theater, opera, or dance hall, avidly creating and consuming print productions, especially newspapers, supporting an empowerment of women, changing how men and women interact in public and emphasizing the nuclear family, believing in the global good of science and technology, and more. Effendis pitted this way of life or habitus, to use the term coined by sociologist Bourdieu, as progress or modernity against what they defined as traditionalism and backwardness, and associated with religion. This view was shared across almost all religious communities in Egypt, including its Jews. Now, to return to Shahata Uzon's coffee house, Ahwat al-Sharq was located on a stretch of the famous Al-Khalij al-Masri Street, Port Said Street today, in the neighborhood of Daher. The Uzon family lived not far away in a Sabri Street, also in Daher. And I should say something here about the urban development of Cairo in this period, because it provided the physical space, the public stage for the Egyptian middle class to perform its new ways and styles, or its class identity. Although building outside the walls of Mamluk Ottoman Cairo had begun earlier, The expansion of the city since the mid-19th century was historically significant in both scale and character. Khedive Ismail, who ruled between 1863 to 79, is usually credited with initiating this building spree, following the economic boom of the 1860s, and also with determining its nature, building a new city outside the old one that would be nothing less than Paris on the Nile. Thus, the new neighborhoods he commissioned to the west were fitted with wide, straight boulevards, squares, parks, European-style buildings, a modern opera house, theaters, even a circus and a zoo. Another wave of urban expansion, even more significant in scale, took place between the 1860s and the 1920s. This time it was led by private interests with little government involvement, but according to the same modern and European-inspired blueprint. These new neighborhoods created new social realities. One was a class division. Whereas inside the walls of Old Cairo, rich and poor lived together, the new expansions of the city were first and foremost a playground for the aristocracy and the rich. However, the economic boom allowed the emerging Effendia, the middle class, to move into the new neighborhoods as well. In this way, a class division was inscribed onto Cairo's new map. The old city was inhabited by the lower classes and the poor, many of whom were also recent immigrants from around the country, while the adjacent new neighborhoods were populated by the Effendia, and the rich built their villas on the banks of the Nile or in other suburban areas. The new neighborhoods were also home to many of the immigrants from outside Egypt. However, it should be noted that at no point in time did foreigners or expatriates constitute a majority anywhere in Cairo. Similarly, Jews were never concentrated in a single area of the capital. The only Jewish urban area popularly identified as such was Harat el-Yahud, the Jews' alley in Arabic, in Old Cairo. Most Jews, rich and poor, concentrated in Harat el-Yahud, where most of the synagogues were consequently located. However, many Jews lived in other parts of the old city as well. By the 1930s, however, only about 24% of Cairo's Jews still lived in different neighborhoods of the old city. These numbers represent both an exodus of Jews from Old Cairo to the new neighborhoods, as well as the multitude of Jewish immigrants that settled in the latter from the start. While the Jewish elite settled in the most affluent neighborhoods and suburbs, most Jews concentrated in the new middle-class parts of Cairo, especially those that were adjacent to Harat el-Yahud, to its immediate west and north, Daher and Abbasiyah. Most of the new synagogues built in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th were located there, as well as the new Jewish schools, yeshivot, the community offices, and Beit Din. The Jewish presence in Daher and Abbasiyah was conspicuous, but it did not turn them into Jewish neighborhoods. These areas were also heavily populated by Egyptian Copts and other Christian immigrants who built their own imposing churches and schools there. Abbasiyah, for example, is still home to the St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Cathedral, which is the seat of the Coptic Pope. The majority of inhabitants in these neighborhoods, however, were still Muslim. The difference then between Muslim, Christian, Jewish Harat el-Yahud in Old Cairo and Muslim, Christian, Jewish Daher, Abbasiyah, or Muski in New Cairo was not in their religious mix. The difference was in the socioeconomic class of their inhabitants, in their urban infrastructure, planning and architecture. It was the difference between Ottoman Cairo and Paris on the Nile. This dichotomy, which did not necessarily correspond to reality, was central to the Jewish middle class mental mapping of Cairo and to the making of their own class identity. It has continued to be central in their collective memory of life in Egypt even after they left it. Jewish charity and social reform efforts were concentrated on alleviating the plight of the Jewish poor in Harat el-Yahud. Jewish newspapers of the time often described the area and its Jewish inhabitants as dirty, unhygienic, diseased, and shamefully indigent. They posed a problem for the middle-class Jewish community that needed to be fixed. Middle-class Jews who lived in the modern neighborhoods would not usually set foot in the strange Hara, unless for some religious ritual in one of the ancient synagogues or to buy matzos for Passover. It should be emphasized that Jews had picked up such class-based views of Cairo's physical and human geography from the non-Jewish society in which they lived, both from foreign visitors or residents, as well as from local Muslim effendis. Jews then understood Cairo as their Muslim and Christian neighbors understood it, a city whose physical, infrastructural, and architectural differences intersected with class boundaries and their concomitant lifestyles, rather than religious or ethnic differences. Finally, I should emphasize that by the 1940s, Daher and Abbasiyya too were already considered downtrodden and lower status in comparison to the even newer and more modern neighborhoods that were rapidly built westward toward the Nile. Uzon's coffee house, then, a lower middle class establishment located in a lower middle class majority Muslim neighborhoods of Daher, not too far from Harat el-Yahud, a neighborhood that boasted a conspicuous Jewish and Christian immigrant population. Uzon also owned an adjacent bar. As you know, Jews and Christians in Muslim majority societies have long been associated with the manufacture and sale of alcohol. But conspicuous public consumption of alcohol was normalized in this period by the adoption of European practices and by the influx of immigrants. Alcohol was now openly consumed in the new bars, clubs, casinos, dance halls, and even in some coffee houses that spread around the new parts of Cairo. Thus, the sale of alcohol connects Uzon's bar to a long pre-modern history of Jewish association. However, in its sociocultural practices, its physical design, and its position in the spatial context of the neighborhood, Uzon's bar was a thoroughly modern institution. As for this spatial context, Ahwat al-Sharq was close to a well-known movie theater called Victoria, a Daher landmark that features frequently in testimonies of the neighborhood's Jews. Down the street, there were two other coffee houses, bars and casinos owned by two other Jewish Egyptians. One was Jamil, a family friend of the Uzons, and there were also a Ahwa Baladia, a low-class local coffee house, and a Buza place. Buza is a kind of alcohol, heavily associated by lower-class Black Egyptians. Except for perhaps for the latter two, the other establishments around Ahwat al-Sharq were also part of and vehicles for modern life, entertainment, and sociability in Cairo. And they were all patronized by the neighborhood's lower middle class residents, regardless of religion. Moreover, Ahwat al-Sharq and its adjacent bar were also modern in their design. Uzon filled them with dozens of small tables and chairs, both indoors and outdoors. This special design may seem unremarkable today, but older coffee houses in Cairo used a diwan-styled internal design with floor-level couches running along the wall or with long wooden benches, mastaba in Arabic, in the poor ones. The cultural practices in Shahata Uzon's coffee house and bar were also emblematic of Egyptian middle-class urban modernity. He sometimes hired an oud player to entertain his many customers in the evenings with the popular Arab Egyptian songs of the day, and he had a radio in the coffee house too. These kinds of entertainment replaced older ones, such as the storyteller, famous Hakawati in Arabic. As for food and drink, Ahwat al-Sharq offered coffee and alcohol, probably also strong tea, and a light fare of meze. These were all parts of earlier Ottoman foodways, yet some of them were revamped in the 19th and 20th century. For example, the kinds of coffee that were served had changed. The French popularized the practice of sweetening the coffee, and as mentioned above, openly serving alcohol was also new. Uzon's staff and clientele were a mix of the neighborhood's Muslims, Christians, especially Greeks, and Jews. Uzon employed about 5 Muslim waiters and a barman, as well as a Jewish manager, while he himself used to move around between the tables, regaling the customers with jokes and funny stories. Most of those customers were men, although Uzon's wife usually occupied a large table in the coffee house for her and her female friends, much to Shahata's chagrin. It seems that a few women did frequent Ahwat al-Sharq, especially as part of family outings. There was an increased and visible presence of women in certain types of coffee houses during this period, and in itself it was a hallmark of changes in gender relations, changes that were ideologically associated with middle-class modernity. Indeed, coffee houses like Ahwat al-Sharq have mainly served as hubs for local social interaction and bonding. The neighborhood's Muslims and Jews sat together at the same table, drank the same coffee and alcohol together, ate the same meze, enjoyed the same music, and shared the same laughs offered by Uzon. Excuse me for a minute. Sorry about that. Maurice remembers that special atmosphere with great affection, and I quote, "Back then, no differences were felt or any distress or hatred between us and them, that in Jews and Muslims, only respect and mutual appreciation, even tight friendship." Most of Uzon's customers were Muslims, but there were likely more Jews and Christians who patronized his coffee house and bar than other such places in Cairo, due to their higher numbers in Daher. This, however, did not make Ahwat al-Sharq a Jewish coffee house. Examining the role of coffee houses in the making of Jewish and Hebrew intellectual networks and literature, literary historian Shachar Pinsker posited the existence of Jewish coffee houses in Europe and in the United States. These were either Jewish-owned and operated coffee houses with a majority of Jewish clientele, or coffee houses largely patronized by Jews. In Egypt, however, there was no particular Jewish association with certain coffee houses, either by ownership, clientele, or other cultural markers. There were only Greek coffee houses in that sense, especially in Alexandria. But there was no Jewish equivalent. Shahata Uzon, a coffee house owner, just happened to be Jewish, and a number of his customers, but not most, also just happened to be Jewish. The primary cultural and social markers of Ahwat Sharq were its modernity and its middle classness. It was contrasted with the Ahwa Baladia and the Buza place down the street. As an institution dedicated to sociability, Ahwat Sharq gave Uzon a certain unofficial position of power in the everyday social fabric of the neighborhood. Maurice described him as a kind of Sheikh el-Hara. Before the turn of the 20th century, this was a formal position of power held by a neighborhood notable or strongman who mediated between the neighborhood's population and higher level state authorities. It no longer existed in mid-20th century Cairo, with the centralization of the Egyptian state and the expansion of its ability to reach individuals directly. However, Maurice's description echoes the informal power that his father had, thanks to the networks and the close social ties that he carefully cultivated. For example, Maurice remembers when a new night watchman took his father into police custody for selling alcohol after midnight. Shahata was able to bribe his way out of trouble. This incident shows how important were Shahata's personal relationships with the representatives of state authority on the local neighborhood level for the smooth operation of his business. It shows how easily such ties could be disrupted, but also how quickly they could be repaired and maintained. Shahata Uzon used his connections to help others with the authorities too. For example, he helped a Jewish female relative to extricate herself from an unhappy marriage to a Muslim man by facilitating her move to Palestine. Shahata Uzon's social power and position as Jew among Muslims were put to the test in 1948 and afterwards. The rise of Pan-Arabism and Pan-Islamism in Egypt during the 1930s and 40s increased public interest in the escalating Zionist-Palestinian conflict. This interest, together with the exacerbating anti-colonial struggle against the British, resulted in certain groups of non-Jewish Egyptians associating all Jewish Egyptians with Zionism. Such tensions erupted into violent incidents against Jews in Cairo as early as 1945, and more so after Egypt's defeat in the 1948 war with Israel. Although such instances of violence were still limited in scope at this point in time, they were enough to cause many Jewish Egyptians to leave Egypt. These developments manifested themselves in the small world of Ahwat Sharq. Maurice recalls how certain groups of Muslim students from the nearby School of Commerce started to taunt and harass the neighborhood Jewish youngsters during this period. In one incident, they chased Maurice and his friends on their way back from a self-defense class in Daher's Maccabi Club. Maurice and his best friend Oni landed a couple of blows on their attackers before fleeing to Jamil's, Oni's father's, coffee house for protection. A famous Muslim wrestler called Mukhtar Hussein, who was present at the coffee house, rose to defend the Jewish friends and to deter the Muslim students. Together with Jamil, he diffused the situation and made peace between the two groups of youngsters over some free cold sodas. But in May 1948, another much larger group of Muslim attackers, railing against Zionists and Jews, managed to destroy Jamil's coffee house. Fearful groups of neighborhoods neighborhood Jews ran to Uzon's Ahawat Shark for refuge. Shahata managed to close the door behind them and protect them from the assailants, while using his connections to call for help from the nearby police station. A police contingent arrived and dispersed the angry crowd. These two incidents exposed the intricacy of Jewish-Muslim relations in times of heightened tensions and violence on the everyday neighborhood level. Above all, they show how these relations withstood challenges that both frayed and enhanced Jewish-Muslim ties at the same time. The groups of Muslim students were ideologically and politically motivated to perpetrate acts of violence against the neighborhood's Jews. At the same time, the two Jewish coffeehouse owners, Jamil and Shahata, used the close relationships they built with the neighborhood's Muslims over the years to quell that violence. Jamil by turning to a local Muslim strongman who was his client, and Shahata by calling on the police force whom he knew. Coffee houses and bars were not the only spaces that offered Jews and non-Jews new opportunities to socialize in modern Cairo. One of Maurice Uzon's best childhood memories involved some of Daher's Jewish and Muslim families going on a weekly excursion to Cairo's famous lemon gardens. The Orman Gardens, Hadiqat al-Orman in Arabic, popularly known as the Lemon Gardens for its 10,000 citrus trees, were part of the much larger gardens of the Giza Palace built by Khedive Said in the middle of the 19th century on the western bank of the Nile, an area that was a playground for the Egyptian aristocracy and still is an affluent suburb today. Originally a 90 acres botanical garden that supplied all Khedive palaces with fruits and vegetables, by the time of Maurice's childhood in the 1930s and 1940s, the lemon gardens were reduced to about 25 acres in order to make way for another icon of modern Cairo, the first zoo in the Middle East. More importantly, these gardens were open to the public, and the Egyptian middle and lower classes used them for picnicking. This particular leisure activity also has a long history. Creating parks for leisure outside of cities can be traced back to the early modern period in the Middle East, but creating them within big cities, specifically for recreational purposes, was relatively new in the late 19th century. Some of these parks were clearly geared toward the middle classes, such as the famous Azbakia Park built in the 1870s as a centerpiece of Cairo's new expansion. In its first decades, it was gated and required an entry fee, which limited access to the middle classes who could afford it. However, public parks with free access were frequented by the lower middle classes. Maurice remembers that every week, a well-to-do Muslim neighbor who owned a transportation company, a close friend of Shahata Uzon and a regular of Ahawat Shark, provided the neighborhood's Jewish and non-Jewish families a bus to take them to the lemon gardens for free. The grown-ups would spend the time picnicking with an abundance of food, chatter, and laughter, while teenage Jewish boys and girls would use the rare opportunity to socialize. Maurice only mentions here Jewish boys and girls pursuing each other, but the opportunity that the lemon gardens offered for youngsters of both genders to meet each other in a legitimate way very likely extended to non-Jews as well. Although considered a taboo in the Jewish community, many Jewish life stories from 20th century Egypt reveal that romantic relationships and marriages between Jews and Christians, and to a lesser degree between Jews and Muslims, were not uncommon. Coffeehouses and public parks were part of a much longer list of public places in Cairo that Jews used in order to fully participate in a kind of middle-class culture that neutralized but did not erase their Jewishness. Take, for example, the high-end exclusive sporting clubs in Cairo, such as the Gezira Sporting Club or the Ma'adi Club. Like the public park that the Uzons and their friends used to enjoy, these sporting and social clubs offered a new, modern kind of outdoor leisure activity for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim families alike. However, there was a marked class difference between the Lemon Gardens and the Gezira or Ma'adi clubs. While lower middle class and even lower class families picnicked in the former, aristocratic or upper middle class families enjoyed tennis, golf, and dainty hors d'oeuvre served by uniform waiters in the latter. Finally, it should be emphasized that there were also exclusively Jewish public spaces in Cairo beyond the obvious religious institutions such as synagogues. There were, for example, Jewish sporting clubs like Maccabi, which had branches both in the affluent Cairo suburbs of Heliopolis and in Daher. Upper middle class Jews established fraternities and sororities, such as the Bnei Brit and Deborah Lodges, respectively, which took after organizations like the Freemasonry that became popular with the Egyptian higher classes in the 19th and 20th centuries. These places and others showcased a confident and affluent Jewish community, but rather than signal segregationist attitudes, they signaled Jewish integration into the urban fabric of Cairo. Not only did such places imitate non-Jewish ones, their Jewish members moved comfortably and frequently between them. Finally, and just for the sake of closure, let me come full circle and tell you the rest of the Uzon family story. As I've said, Maurice Uzon emphasized that his family's social bonds with Muslims remained strong despite the growing tensions and challenges after 1948. And I quote, "The friendship and loyalty that had been built over the years between my father and his Gentile friends, despite the religious differences, remained stable and unshaken until my parents left Egypt and made Aliyah, or migrated to Israel in 1952." End of quote. How did that happen? Well, as a teenager, Maurice himself joined the Zionist youth movement and emigrated to Israel alone in 1949. When he was 16 years old, one of only a few hundred Egyptian Jews to do so. His mother could not stand that separation, so under her massive pressure, Shahata closed down his successful coffee house and bar, and they too immigrated to Israel 3 years after their son. This was also relatively early compared to the main wave of Jewish Egyptian immigration in 1957. Maurice's emphasis on the extremely personal motives of his parents' chain migration out of Egypt is commensurate with his emphasis on Shahata's success and strong social bonds in Cairo, despite the historical challenges. Finally, even this emigration did not sever the Uzon's ties to Cairo, at least not Maurice's. After the 1979 peace accords between Israel and Egypt, Maurice returned to Cairo many times as a tour guide for Israeli tourist groups. So to sum everything up, I argue that the urban history of Cairo's Jews in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th one is a story about migration, both to and within Cairo. It is a story about social hierarchy and social mobility, and about using the city to perform their newly acquired middle classness. Cairo's Jews participated in the actual mental and social remapping of the sprawling city, where a dichotomy was created between the old and the new, the backward and the modern, the poor and the rich. Uzon's Ahwat al-Sharq was not a Jewish coffee house, but rather a modern one, in contrast to the Ahwa Baladia down the street. In its architecture and decor, the food and drink it served, the entertainment it offered, and the lower middle class clientele it hosted, Ahwat al-Sharq epitomized an Egyptianized version of European-inspired modern social culture. Ahwat al-Sharq was a crucial meeting place for Daher's Jews and Muslims. It fostered strong social bonds between them that withstood tension and crisis, and gave Uzon some social power on the local level as a facilitator. Other public spaces in the modern city offered its Jews the same opportunities, whether picnicking in the lemon gardens, sharing office space at work, being educated in either French or modern Arabic curriculum, playing in the same sport teams, meeting in the same social clubs or Masonic lodges, going to the same cinema, theaters, or dance halls. Jewish and Muslim Egyptians shared the same middle class or effendi lifestyle. What was at stake here for those Jewish Egyptians, recent immigrants from often modest socioeconomic origins, was the opportunity to achieve and perform their modern middle classness without their Jewishness being an impediment. This must have been strongly appealing to them more than any ideology of equality, be it nationalist, communist, or other. So locating Jews and Muslims back together in the same spaces provides a fuller and extremely nuanced view of the bonds as well as the tensions between them. It does not shy away from the tensions. In fact, the story of Ahwat al-Sharq and the Uzon family shows how those tensions grew inside the neighborhoods. They were not outside intrusions that struck an idyllic coexistence. But this story also shows how relatively quickly these tensions were resolved using the long-standing relationships that Daher Jews built over the years with the neighborhood's Muslims. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alon, for this fascinating talk, mapping out the Jewish life and integrated into the urban fabric of Cairo. I have a lot of, and I invite people to put questions or comments. There was one question, but you happened to answer that as you were talking. It was about women's place in these coffee houses. It struck me, and it was very interesting. When you were talking about the rhetoric about the Harat al-Yahud from the upper classes, the Jewish upper classes, it struck me like it's the same thing that we've been seeing in, European or even American reactions to what was then termed the Jewish ghetto, right? And not in but the metaphorical Jewish ghetto. In whether it's in Eastern Europe, the poor downtrodden, and that's I wonder whether you can comment on it, because I think at some level it supports your argument about the middle classness, about the idea of the middle class rather than the specific identities that are coming through. So I wonder whether you could get us started on this.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, these changes in perception, especially middle class perception of poverty and poor Jews and the nature of philanthropy, which I also just published an article about specifically on Jewish Egyptian philanthropy in Cairo. This history was shared, yes, absolutely, with European Jewish communities, but also with Jewish communities across the Middle East and North Africa. Egypt wasn't unique in that sense. The urban history of expansion and building modern neighborhoods in the old cities is also something that cities all across the Middle East, from Istanbul to Baghdad to Tangier in Morocco, also shared. And yes, those perceptions of poverty and this new urban history, or new mental maps created of the new cities and how they intersected. This is a shared history. What I think is unique in the Jewish Egyptian case is maybe the scale and rapidness in which this process historically happened. We're just within a few decades, maybe half a century at most, and maybe how vehement middle class Jewish Egyptians were in describing old Harat Lahud along those lines of a downtrodden place. And that to me really underscores the class aspect of this. I argue in all of my studies that the most salient identity of Jewish Egyptians was class identity above all, above national identification or even religious one. It was class. So this speaks to this class dimension that I am emphasizing so much, because it wasn't emphasized as much in current scholarship, at least about Jews in the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from a student about whether you could speak briefly about the religious traditions of Cairo's Jews. And the follow-up question is whether rabbis were recruited from other countries. So I know your talk was about the sort of secular and the fabric, but the religious aspect, whether you could say a few words about that.
Great question, because the religious aspect of the Jewish community in Egypt, at least in the 19th and 20th century, is really understudied. It is a common perception, but I say this carefully because, again, it is so understudied. I haven't studied it. So I want, and I have suspicions about how true it is. So I will say it carefully, but the common perception of Jews in Egypt is that they were not that much religious, and that speaks to again their emphasis on modernity, their emphasis on middle classness, or being part of that middle class modern culture, which de-emphasized religiosity. I'm not even talking about secularism. Well, it existed. There were Jewish communists who were certainly atheists, but I'm not. Most of them would be religious, but religiosity really was focused on, Shabbat services and high holidays or events like weddings or burial. And in fact, responding to your question about recruiting rabbis, yes, it was very common in the Jewish Egyptian community to recruit rabbis from outside Egypt. mostly from Palestine, Israel, including most famously Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who later became the leader of the Israeli religious Shas movement or party. So he had a stint in Cairo, but for example, him and there were other examples of rabbis recruited from Italy earlier in the century. They had words to say about the lack of sufficient religiosity of Egyptian Jews. So that's what I can say about it. But again, this needs more study.
Mm-hmm. And the sort of moving on as the period progresses, there are clearly, I mean, some of your characters did not move away because they were pushed out because of violence or thing, but there was percolating violence. You mentioned some attacks on that. So I have two questions. One is about Egyptian nationalism and its sort of formation and how it was or different kinds. I assume there were different voices and different sort of conceptions of imagining the Egyptian nationality, that some may have been more inclusive and less exclusive and more inclusive and some more exclusive. And the other one related, someone asks about the kind of a comparison in the Egyptian Muslim community in exclusion and attacks on Jews versus exclusion and attacks on Copt Christians.
Right. Yes. So Egyptian nationalism and the evolvement of Egyptian nationalism is one of the more over-studied topics in Egyptian history, and it indeed went through sea changes in this time period, late 19th century and first half of the 20th century. And it morphed and re-morphed throughout the decades. Early versions, those mostly prevalent until the 1940s, at least, were indeed more inclusive and sort of religiously blind. And talked about they had slogans such as religion is for God, but the nation is for all Egyptians. So that was kind of welcoming to Jews and Copts. And some Jews indeed participated and were nationalist activists. Then when Egyptian nationalism took on a more pan-Arab and pan-Islamic streak, which kind of like amplified the component of care for the Palestinians in conflict with the Zionist movement and then Israel. So that's when Egyptian nationalism became more exclusive, and it excluded all foreigners. And you have to add to that, of course, the anti-colonial struggle against the British. So that's why Egyptian nationalism was very anti-colonial and anti-foreign. Now, there is a process here where Jews, indigenous Jews to Egypt, became foreigners, which they never were. So they became foreigners and were excluded from the Egyptian Egyptian nation or imaginary of the nation. Again, I have to mention here communism and socialism, which were strong movements in the first half of the 20th century, at least, and Jews were actually leaders in socialist and communist movements. Unsurprisingly, they were all over the world, precisely because these are ideologies that emphasized equality between religious communities. These were religiously blind ideological movements. But I think like the bulk of the community in actual everyday life subscribed to that middle class urban culture because it also promised a kind of a religiously blind way of life without all the political commitments of ideological movements or parties. So I think that's why it was so strongly appealing to Egyptian Jews. So that's my argument in my work that that urban middle class culture was as on par with ideological movements like Egyptian nationalism in its early versions and communism and socialism that promised equality.
I have two more questions, and then we'll, I guess, wrap up. Related, sort of tying back to the quote that you opened your talk with, which seemed very nostalgic about the lost life, the past in Egypt. So one part of my question is when is there a breaking point that is clearly Jews left, and even the little bit of the violence and those episodes that you were discussing, but what is the breaking point that there is no more patching up, right? No more somebody calls friends and leans on those bonds. When do these bonds break? What makes them break? And the other thing a question I have is what happened to these families? I assume also including your own, considering the Tam family archive, that after they returned, after they moved to Israel, and whether that nostalgia that is captured in the Uzon quote, with which Ustor has something to do also with their social position after they moved to the new state of Israel.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this were my grandmother and grandfather in those pictures from the clubs. Yes, thank you. So the breaking point was pretty clear, and it was in 1948. Tensions rose after 1948, and some Jews did live on their own volition after 1948. But the bulk of the community was either deported or otherwise pushed out in 1957 after the 1956 war, in which Israel famously colluded with Britain and France to attack Egypt, the famous Suez crisis. So that really epitomized a process that was already going on for several years of identifying all Jews with Zionist or with support to Israel. So the Egyptian regime at that time just pushed the bulk of the community out in 1957. And they were actually recognized as refugees at that time by the UN Refugee Agency. So that historically was the breaking point. The rest of the small community that remained in Egypt was expelled after the 1967 war. And after 1970, we don't talk anymore about that. There's no Jewish community, an organized Jewish community to talk about in Egypt, only individuals, right? And that's another story. So the breaking point was 1957, and indeed, in if you listen to the narratives in Jewish Egyptian collective memory, that event, that 1957 event, was came as a shock to the bulk of the community. Again, even though tensions were rising after 1948, which really, I think, underscores what Uzon is saying, that yes, tensions arose, but still connections were still strong after 1948. That after 1957, that 1957 came as a shock to them. It was really, they describe it in terms of either the expulsion of from paradise, or the expulsion with a big E from Spain in the 1492 expulsion, right? So yes, very interestingly, to your responding to your second question, I think the dominant voice in Jewish Egyptian memory work, when after they go to Israel and also to France and the U.S., emphasizing the dominant voice, which was the middle class voice, and emphasizing this middle classness, I think was also a tool to position themselves in the social hierarchy in which they found themselves in Israel. Between Ashkenazis on the top of the social hierarchy and Mizrahim on the bottom of it, and Jews from Egypt emphasizing their middle classness in their memories and their very strong nostalgia, I think was also a kind of a performance, a social performance of status to belong to the stronger social echelons of Israel. Maybe a little bit, if not dissociating themselves from the rest of the Mizrahim, being somewhere like in between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. So nostalgia, I argue, became a tool, a social tool for Jewish Egyptians after their emigration to Israel and other places as well.
Yeah, I have so many more questions, and it's such a fascinating topic. And I hope we'll have you back
I'd love to.
on the panel, maybe in other forums. And I really want to thank you for joining us in these very difficult times, enlightening us, taking our minds off your dire situation that you are living in. And please stay safe. And thank you again. And thank you all for joining us. I sent the link to the film. If you haven't watched it yet, it's you can see it until tomorrow. So Alon, toda rabba.
Thank you, Magda, for having me. It was my pleasure.
Bye. Thank you. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.